Hi, everybody. Good to see y'all. And hello to folks who are attending online, too. I'm happy to be live streaming this event as well. We're really excited about it, but thank you all for coming. As we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the land where PNCA is located rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River and continue to live in these areas. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect the work of the Native nations, leaders, and families, and make ongoing efforts to center Indigenous knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance. So our design lecture series here at PNCA welcomes in a diverse range of creative folks to explore the broad and vibrant possibilities of what design can be and do in the world today. And I can't think of a better person to epitomize that mantra, call to work, than Dori Tunstall. Before we get started, I just want to say thanks to all the folks who helped prepare for this visit, including Danny, our wonderful tech rep up in the booth upstairs. Woo! The awesome students of the Advanced Studio in Design who helped work with me on promotions for this event. And Dori's team who worked with us to set up this talk as well, including friends, family, colleagues, the whole deal. To Flo, who generally helps everything run smoothly and keeps us, or maybe I should say me, from flying away like an untethered balloon. And all of our community partners and friends who are here in person and online today learning with us. So welcome. Now to the main event. Elizabeth Dori Tunstall is a design anthropologist, a public intellectual, and a design advocate who works in the spaces where critical theory, culture, and design intersect. As Dean of Design at Ontario College of Art and Design University, she's the first Black and first Black female dean of a faculty of design. A recognized leader in the decolonization of art and design education, her new book, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook, uses real-life examples and case studies that she's drawn from 15 years of working or more to transform institutions to better reflect the lived experiences, the real experiences of Indigenous, Black, and people of color communities. In her book, she first asks how modernist design has encompassed and advanced the harmful project of colonization, then shows, by examples, how design might address these harms by recentering its theory and practice in global Indigenous cultures and histories. For me personally, I'll risk being kind of a fangirl, which is a word I've heard a few times today already, by saying I first became aware of Dori's work in 2019. And as we moved into the pandemic that is still evolving, I was lonely. I was new to my role here at PNCA as department head, and I was hungry for learning. I was attending many protests, many lectures, looking for lifelines, and Dori always seemed to be leading by example. She was always in these spaces that I was lucky enough to tap into and witness and engage with. Including the Where the Black Designers Conference, but not only that conference, many other spaces. She always seemed to be leading by example, tough but kind, and very beloved. In just a few minutes talking with her today, I can totally see why, and I'm honored to share her light with all of you today. So without further ado, here's Dori Tunstall.
So I'm gonna take the mic with me, just because I am not really taller than the podium. So let's see if I can get this out. All right. So thank you first for the beautiful, beautiful introduction. I'm so happy to be here today to share with you a little bit about decolonizing design. So first, thank you for allowing me to be a guest, and I really appreciate the land acknowledgement here. I am also a guest in Toronto, Toronto, which is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the lands in which I live and create. In Toronto, which is treaty land, specifically Treaty 13, and the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon, which is a wampum belt, which is another form in which covenant is created. But I am also the daughter of Teresa and Joseph, the daughter of Raymond and Letha, the granddaughter of Dolores and Johnny, the granddaughter of Betty and George, the great-granddaughter of Katrina and Raymond, and descendants of other ancestors known and unknown. Ashe. And I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, the lands of the Catawba, Pidi, Chicora, Adisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chickasaw nations. And I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the lands of the Kickapoo, the Kashkashkia, and the Miami nations. It is important to acknowledge both the lands and ancestors because it's a really important part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is decolonizing design. Knowing in some ways who you are and where you stand and how that affects the positionality that you take to the land itself and to the peoples of the many different lands. Before I go further, I want to give a shout out to the amazing design team that worked on decolonizing design because the book, because it is also part of this process of decolonization. So my team was made up of Black and Indigenous designers. MIT Press did not have Black or Indigenous designers on staff. So kudos to them in terms of giving me the autonomy to create my own dream team. And so the illustrations, which you'll see throughout the presentation, is by a Nigerian-Canadian illustrator named Anna Agi. The book cover design is by Sadie Redwing, who's a Lakota Dakota designer. And this encircling that happens is the brief that I gave to her was that I wanted this book to be wrapped in Indigenous love, which she has done beautifully. And the interior design of the book is by Polymote Studio, which is a company that is made up of Silas Monroe, who's a African, like parents from Africa, American designer, and Brian Johnson, who is also an Indigenous designer. And so this is my dream team, and there's like sacred geometry that's built into the book, and so I wanted to recognize them because this relationship is part of decolonizing design. But let me get to the content. So decolonizing design, the book, what I'm seeking to address is the question is like what it might mean to decolonize design. And I focus on meaning because like if you go into definitions, then you're entering a space of debate, and this is not a space of debate. Decolonizing design means very specific things to me, but it might mean something different to others. And so engaging in a conversation, a sharing around meaning is again also part of this process of decolonization. And that the things that it means to me now is putting Indigenous first, dismantling the tech bias in the European modernist project, and I'll break all that down, what I mean by that. Dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project, making through amends through more than diversity, equity, and inclusion, and reprioritizing existing resources to decolonize, which is always like you have to end with the business case, and it's like, That's the business case chapter. But I don't have time to talk about all of that. So I'm going to really focus on putting Indigenous first and decolonizing design, meaning dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project. And again, I choose which chapters I engage with based on the audience. And so this selection has been specifically curated to, I think, engage in conversations that I hope will continue here and maybe feed into conversations that are already happening. So what does decolonizing design mean? Putting Indigenous first. So I've lived in many, many different places. I've spent a lot of time, I grew up in, of course, the United States. I've lived part of the time for my PhD thesis in Ethiopia. I lived for almost 7 years in Melbourne, Australia. And only in the last 6 years have I moved to Toronto, Ontario, Toronto. Now, in my experience in Australia is where I had a very refined understanding of what it means to put Indigenous first. Because in many ways, Australia leads around, like where I learned to do land acknowledgement is in Australia, where the work I was doing in Australia was bringing, with my colleague Norm Sheehan, Indigenous ways of knowing into a design curriculum, which is what got me the gig at OCAD University. But it is only in the context of Canada that I really understood what it meant to put Indigenous first, because as my colleague Ryan Rice, who is Mohawk, sat me down, and he had spent a lot of time in the United States, what he made clear to me is that even though the dynamic most of the time of, let's say, social justice in the United States is black and white, the dynamic in Canada is red and white. And so you, as a black person coming from the United States, coming from a positionality, again, where you're expected to speak up and speak out, you have to understand your positionality of what it means to be a black person here in Canada. And so and that meant putting Indigenous first. And one of the things that shocked me when I got into Canada was they actually had this notion of, then it was BIPOC, but we've put Indigenous first, so now it's IBPOC. But BIPOC, because I was like, well, I know the history of the term POC, and it was created by African American women when they found that the needs of other women of color were shared, and so we created this term. So why is it somehow black people are excluded from this category? And it's only upon reading Eve Tuck and Kay Wang Yang's Decolonization as a Metaphor that I was able to find a framework to help me understand why BIPOC, IBPOC, had to or needed to exist, not just in the Canadian context, but other contexts as well. And in Tuck and Yang's Decolonization and Metaphor, they discuss what they call the triad of positionality in settler colonialism. So again, and what distinguishes settler colonialism is normally, again, the story of settlers in the last 500 years as being Europeans who've left actually awful conditions in Europe to build a good life in United States, Canada, South America, the Caribbean, all these other places. And in doing so, displaced first through disease, so let's say unintentional. When they found that it works intentionally, there was some intentionality that was actually built around that. Through rape, murder, all these sort of extreme violent acts, take away the land, remove the people from the land, Indigenous people from the land, and take ownership of the land, set up policies of assimilation in order to justify the theft of the land. So Indigenous people in the relationship to this native, slave, and settler relationship that Tuck and Yang sets up is that, again, Indigenous people have been slaves. Sometimes we forget the fact that the first slaves were Indigenous people. And it's only when diseases that were brought by Europeans so decimated the population that the solution to that problem of labor was to basically still Africans who had already had immunity to European diseases through many, many centuries of trade, to bring them over to, again, the United States, to Canada, to all these other places. So, but it's important to realize that the first enslaved people were Indigenous people. But they are also the original peoples of the land, which is what we recognize when we do the land acknowledgement. And the relationship to the land is one thing, but there's also the relationship to the colonial assimilationist policy. So what has happened in places like United States and Canada is that in relationship to the Indigenous people, the strategy, once decimation was not effective in the way that the colonial settler state thought it would be or wanted it to be, was to assimilate them. So 500 plus years, Indigenous people have been fighting assimilation. The most, right now, the conversations that are happening in Canada is the finding of the bodies of children in residential schools, which is the ultimate manifestation of that policy. And so Indigenous people have had to fight assimilation. Black folks, in terms of their relationship, again, to the settler colonial state and the land, are positioned as slaves. Again, now that there's more immigration, there's those who have come in as settlers, as new settlers. But even those who generally come in as new settlers, there's some history of enslavement there. So they were brought in as slaves, and the reason why we have Black Lives Matter is in relationship to the settler colonial state, unassimilatable. The whole entire structure of white supremacy is about the inassimilatable of Black folks. And I talk about the fact that, it's like, my name is Elizabeth Tunstall. My first language is English. Many aspects of African American culture, again, it's a hybrid, European, African, even Native American, right? But if you think of a people who've been removed from the land, removed from their languages, sought to be removed from their practices to the point of death, you're not allowed to drum. You're not allowed to speak your language. You're not allowed to, like, we had to hide even our religious practices, right? Within sort of Catholicism to be able to do it. Like, if you think of one group of people who experiences pressures of assimilation so great that it almost worked, and yet we still have overrepresentation of Black folks in the criminal justice system. We have overrepresentation in the foster system. We have overrepresentation in lower socioeconomic indicators. So the whole structure of white supremacy requires that Black folks are not assimilatable. And then again, you also have POC. And again, I know POC is not the best term to basically bring together Asian people, Latinx people, Middle Eastern people, and Asian Pacific people. Like, it's a catch-all term, but it's meant to create a space for solidarity. And in that positionality, again, they come in many times as settlers, but sometimes as slaves, because we have to, again, all of these pathways are different. And depending on their skin color, their level of education, whatever wealth that they may have had in their home countries, which again have been disrupted by colonization itself, which is why they left home to come to places to build a better life, that they have been, in many ways, forced to make painful decisions about assimilating into the settler colonial state. This means, again, understanding the positionality is that we all have different work we have to do in terms of decolonization. We all have to be in solidarity with one another's different work and decolonization. And if you don't understand your positionality, then it's going to be very challenging for you to be able to do the work in decolonization. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. Decolonizing design does not mean 40 acres and a mule. So again, among Black folks, we talk about like our goal in terms of reparation is where's my 40 acres and the mule, right? And this is again was part of like divide and conquer, right? So General Sherman was not really caring about the fact that wanting to provide us with 40 acres and a mule. And by the way, there was no mention of a mule. It was just actually 40 acres, right? And because the way in which things operate is, you know, I always ask, where were those 40 acres coming from? And this manifests itself even now and today. So like after 2020, everyone's like, I need to have my racialized, preferably Black, female, queer leader, right? So I can tick the boxes. And if as Black folks, we're not looking at the fact that, again, our movement is to become part of the system, right? The cry for 40 acres and the mule is like, I want mine. I want my piece of pie, right? That we are part of the erasure and the hurt of Indigenous communities who, again, are the original owners. So this is why 40 acres and a mule is the reason why we need to understand our positionality, because if it's not, then we also become part of the harm. And Vine Deloria Jr. talks about this. One of my favorite books is Custard Died for Your Sins, which again is a book older than I am, but its wisdom lasts forever. Because he talks explicitly about the fact that, again, the strategy for oppression of the Black man, as you talk about, was to exclude Blacks from everything, to exclude them from everything. The process to deal with Indigenous communities was to make them, quote unquote, again, an Anglo-Saxonization of the Indian. And again, if we don't understand how that manifests itself in our relationships to other, we find, again, ourselves in situations where Black Indigenous folks don't feel like they belong, right? Or we find ourselves in situations in which, again, Black folks and Indigenous folks are continuously pitted against each other. Or on the other extreme, you know, you have the Cherokee nations disenrolling Black folks who, again, came with them on the Trail of Tears and were included as part of that community because we're not understanding what our relationship should be in solidarity with one another against structures of white supremacy. Now, I've not always been great at putting Indigenous first. And one of the ways in which I have failed is sometimes in terms of being present. Every year at OCAD University, we have cultural competency training in which we talk about the residential school system. And these are normally led by Indigenous community organizations. And in this process, this is where I'm like, it is really hard to be present. And not out of guilt, but because the trauma that is experienced in Indigenous communities is very close to the trauma that is experienced in Black communities. The way I describe it is that if my Indigenous cousins, let's say, in terms of the relationship, like this is the story of their grandparents, similar stories, it just might be the story of my great-grandparent, right? Or great-great-grandparents. So there's a little bit of generational difference, but the triggering is still there because, as I said, we have the same same metrics in terms of overrepresentation in the prison systems. We have the same metrics of overrepresentation in the child fostering system. We have the same, again, like Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation have to happen together, but those both speak to the great trauma that these communities has experienced. So in the context of, recognition of the impact of the residential schools, the depth and strength of that feeling of anger, loss, resilience, joy affects me in a way that I almost have to shut down, which means I'm not connecting with my Indigenous colleagues because I have to be shut down. But I have a good therapist, and I have very generous colleagues, and I've learned to be present. I've learned to not turn it off, even if I may want to, and also to not center it around me, right? To center it around the way I'm being triggered by the experiences. So it's a hard thing to do, but it's really, really important part of putting Indigenous first, is to be able to feel the stories and the resilience of Indigenous communities, and these are like my friends and colleagues, in a way that I can be present for them, that I can stand up with them. The other way in which I fail, and I don't even know how to deal with this one because I continuously fail at this one, is again, my attachment to colonize time and task. I'm a doer. I like to get things done. And at OCAD, we have an Indigenous Education Council, which I've served on and have had to leave because the consensus-based deliberation processes, which is a really important part of many Indigenous communities, drive me up the wall. I just can't stand still enough. I'm like, this is what we need to do. I don't understand why we just can't get it done, right? And again, it's a thing where I've been on the committees, I've had to leave the committees. It's hurt relationships where it's, again, I have this project I invite an Indigenous colleague to thing, but I have my Gantt chart that needs to be fed in, and they're like, but I need like 6 hours of more consultation with this to be able to move forward. And I'm like, no, we need to move forward. And I break the relationship because I'm still addicted to that colonial time and task, needing to get things done, right? And I get better at it, but it's so hard. It's so, so hard. And I have very generous and loving colleagues who will, in great respect for me, call me out on it. But it's hard, and it's one of the ways in which I fail, and it's one of the ways in which I have to check myself and my desire to make things happen before the community is on board with that happening, because it's not a matter of me moving, it's a matter of us all moving together. But I have success. And when those successes happen, where I put Indigenous first and I'm really present, right? And I'm letting the time unflow, I have these really beautiful, beautiful interactions, right? With Indigenous colleagues and friends and people who feel like family. And I'm just gonna give you a 5-minute taste of what that feels like, so that maybe you have a sense of like how you can begin to build that understanding with. So this is a visit between Peter Moran, who's a enrolled member of Tahltan Nation, and myself, which we did an interview for Rock magazine. And the brief we gave each other was, let's have a conversation as if we don't care about the white gaze, that we're just vibing with each other. Again, trying to understand what it means to decolonize design. And this is a little bit, it was like an hour and a half conversation, but this is 5 minutes of what that felt like, because that's what happens. This is what happens when you get it right. So we're officially recording.
Okay.
So welcome to the conversation.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Dori Tunstall. I'm the Dean of Faculty Design at
Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto. And I'm in conversation with...
Oh, me. Peter Morin. I'm from the Tahltan Nation, which is located in 3 communities in BC, Telegraph Creek, Dease Lake, and Iskoot. I'm a member of the Crow clan of the Tahltan Nation, and I inherit that right and that responsibility from my mother, Janelle Craig. And I work at OCAD in a few different places. Currently I am, and luckily I am the graduate program director of the Interdisciplinary Arts and Masters in Design master's degree. And the advisor to the provost on Indigenous knowledge, practice, and production at OCAD. And I teach with the Faculty of Art. Whoa.
You do a lot. Question we've been asked to discuss is what is decolonizing design? And I think what's really important, I think, of that question is really to first kind of unpack what decolonization is. And design is about getting to the point where, again, the embodiment of making as it relates to our bodies.
Yeah.
It's like they're going to say this is way too complicated. This is definitely not for dummies. The embodiment of our of the objects and the things that we make, right? As it relates to the intimate relationships to our body. That again, many of those things in the last 400 years have been used to again for enslavement.
Yeah.
And so how do we transform the purposes of the things that we make so that they are liberatory, right? And connecting as opposed to confining and isolating in some ways.
Yeah. And I'm like the Black liberation movement and how, like, I think I'm also like thinking about all of the places where these things touch, right? And where they slip over each other, or, and I don't know if I like the word intersection, but I like the thinking around intersections, you know. But because I need to be smarter about that, how she's using that word. Yeah. Anyway, the
really
liberation, yes, thank you, Kimberly's important contribution to work and thinking, like, and how, right, and about how Black liberation and American Indian movement are like very closely aligned, and like they're like siblings a little bit, right? And so, and how those intersections inform the systems and the making by those bodies, like you're saying, like, and I mean, I guess, I mean, there's a few things I go back to a lot, I mean, because we do this work, right? You and I, right? And like, when I was training to be a therapist, they called it a solidarity team. Yeah. And so even on your solidarity team, you folks who've inspired you, right? Folks whose work, keeps your work going and keeps you going. Like, so I'm thinking a little bit about how decolonizing design can also mean, like, how do we bring, if we got to design that object, and then we got to make it, and then you got to give it to somebody to use, right? So it's like you're saying, that enabling of liberation is also part of decolonizing design. Something like that.
Well, and again,
I feel like I need to put on my grandpa's hat for the rest of our visit.
It's too far for me to put my great grandmother's hats on, but I'm channeling my great grandmother's hat.
Decolonizing design means putting Indigenous first. And what that means, particularly for us in design, is that we need to design objects that can transmit liberatory joy to the body as well as to communities. And that's a very different ethos of designing. Like, a lot of things we design now is like, can we design it for efficiency? Can we design it for the fact that we're lazy and we don't want to do this particular work, right? Like, where are we designing things that are transmitting liberatory joy to our bodies, freed bodies, right? As well as to communities. And that's where, again, that understanding the positionality, understanding the relationship to indigeneity opens up new possibilities for what it is that we're designing for and the kinds of objects that we create. So what else does decolonizing design mean? In order to be able to create objects of liberatory joy to the body and communities, we first must dismantle the racist bias in the European modernist project. And as I said, I will explain what I mean by that. So again, great illustration by Anna Aggie. You can recognize, like, one of the things we didn't realize until we finished the series of illustrations is how much I'm influenced by the movies. So almost every single one has like some cinematic reference. And so you can see a little bit of modern times in there. You know, there's a good old modular that I'm not living up to or measuring up to. And I actually do have that outfit. So what do I mean by the modernist design project? It's this grand myth that we have told ourselves that design is something that happened in the 1800s in Europe. And through that design, you have technological progress, which means the masses have access to a better life. And by removing allegiance to your ethnic and national markers, one can join in universal humankind. Now, it actually, they said mankind, but I don't say mankind, so it was a humankind. And this myth is so powerful. Now, in the context of Europe in the 1800s, this is liberatory. Because if you think about Europe, this is a place that has an aristocracy whose job it is to extract everything from everyone. So to say, we're going to give the peasantry a better life through design, like, that is so compelling. And also, again, Europe is a place of great conflict among one another. Like, y'all think Game of Thrones is a fictional? No, it's real. They just put it in a different fantasy land so the Europeans don't get upset, right? So the level of violence, inter-European violence, is going back thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So the idea of saying, let's drop our Frenchness, let's drop our Englishness, let's drop our Germanness, and all become one in universal humankind. Again, utopian in vision. The challenge is, first of all, there are like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of making in other places besides Europe in the 1800s. So we'll start there. And the other thing is that this is not a reality. This is a myth. So in the book, I do go through like the technological progress, and the short cliff version of that is that basically the lives of European people didn't come better until they extracted all the land from indigenous people and extracted all the labor from like Black and other folks. And actually even then, it's only like in the post-war period when everyone was putting in all this money into industry that the lives of Europeans became better. And so they had to leave Europe in order to have a better life. And then through the war, the Europeans who were in the United States gave a lot of money back to Europe in order for them to build a better life. So that's the shortcut version of that, but the book goes much deeper into it with lots of references. It's probably one of the most scholarly chapters in the whole book. What I would like to talk to you about is the racist bias. Because this quite utopian ideal of removing allegiance to your ethnic and national markers, one can join human universal humankind in the context of colonization becomes cultural genocide. And let me explain how that happens. So, where does this myth come from? Many different places. The place where I find it's the most interesting location to find it is in world fairs, right? Because this is, again, part of the mythology is like, the Great Exposition in London is where modern design began and happened, right? And so let's start there as the place of this origin story. And you can see the language, right? In the way in which they describe it, right? So apologies to anyone who's actually English. This is my fake British accent. So, let us all honestly pray that divine providence, which has so benignly watched over and shielded the illustrations of nature's production, conceived by human intellect and fashioned by human skill, may still protect us and may grant us the interchange of knowledge, resulting in the meeting of enlightened people and friendly rivalry, etc., etc., etc. And be happy among promoting unity among nations and peace and goodwill among various races of mankind. So, do I need to point out the bias? Who's the enlightened people? I assure you that in 1850, they are not very concerned with the goodwill among the various races of mankind, because as we know, peak colonization in Europe, which is located within the 1880s, right, is just 30 years after this statement. So if they were following this, we would not have the level of colonization that happened through Great Britain. So, myth busted number one. So this is where, and again, they don't ignore design, right? So again, soon come practically, otherwise we'll go back. The highly civilized man, rendered by science, familiar with the work of uncivilized people, will soon come practically to aid them to acquire the superior qualifications that shall rightly place him at his level. Now, the scary thing about this is that this was a design version of the great chain of being, where you had European, especially English design as the top. You had China and Asia in the middle. And then everything else was basically not even considered design. They were like, oh, that's craft, right? That's craft. If you look at the QS rankings of design institutions, guess what you find? At the top, European and European American or European Australian institutions. Then you begin to see in the 20s and the 30s a little trickling of Chinese and Indian institutions. And then you begin to find maybe in the 40s and 50s, 1 or 2 institutions from Asia. There is absolutely no African design institution that is actually represented in that QS global rankings of design institution. So our great chain of design being is still practiced today in our evaluation of design institutions and who are the top and who has a reputation and who provides the most jobs, because that's what they're looking at. So, design has a bit of a problem. And then there's the beloved Bauhaus, right? And the good thing is a couple of years ago was the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, so there was a lot of dismantling of Bauhaus mythologies as it relates to gender, race, and other categories of exclusion, because when you look at the origins of the Bauhaus, in terms of, let's say, the body that they were designing for, right, that they were supporting with this new modernist design, it was the body of the white, male, working class, and traumatized body, because this is coming out of World War I. Not quite into World War II, but out of World War I. which means that the extent to which we've hold the Bauhaus in esteem, to say this is the pinnacle of design, that we are ignoring anyone else who is not white, cis male. Again, some progress in terms of, like, again, working class, maybe a little bit of progress in terms of, again, understanding that there are injured bodies and injured spirits within that. And straight up racist, right? Writing a letter to Henry Ford and William Randolph Hearst saying, you know, we make our appeal to yourself, great grand white masters of the race, right? So what does it mean when we hold this up as the pinnacle of design? It means that we've built a design ecosystem that has at its root white supremacy. And so where does white supremacy come from? One of the things that actually most surprised me a couple of years ago is I went to go see a lecture by Dr. Jacqueline Battalora. And white supremacy has a time and a place. The time, 1681. The place, unsurprisingly, Maryland. And two things is important about knowing that white supremacy has a time and a place is that, oh my gosh, it's not something from time immemorial. Once upon a time, actually, working class white folks freed blacks, enslaved Africans, indigenous people all got together to overthrow their white European oppressors. And then, this is beginning to feel very familiar. What the white European oppressors did is then they put laws in place that basically pushed the lives of black folks and indigenous folks so far down. Didn't uplift the working class white folks, but just pushed everyone else down so that the working class white folks would see their alliance with the white aristocratic European class. And what this has meant is that our legal systems do not recognize equally the voices and perspectives of women, of racialized black and indigenous folks. Our healthcare systems do not protect the bodies of anyone who's basically that white male working class, because again, the affluent can always afford what it is that they need, right? That design in and of itself does not design for all bodies, all races. And I'll give you, again, sort of concrete examples of this. When I went to go graduate in my cap and gown, I had to get my hair pressed by extremely hot heat, like it could burn your ears. Why? Because the cap and gown design does not accommodate poofy hair, right? Now again, this is not just for black folks, right? Like anyone who has poofy hair has the poofy hair problem, but already in a system that says, you don't belong here, it's just that little tiny bit reminder is like, you don't belong here. Eyeglasses. I have a really short, cute button nose, right? And until I started buying designs from like black designers, never fit, never fit. And again, a tiny little reminder, you don't belong. We won't even talk about, again, so again, I'm a little bit short-ish, right? And even the other day, going to this dinner, and I don't know why everyone has like these tall seats are now like really popular. And so first of all, like, I almost injured myself trying to get into the chair, right? And then the table was to here. Again, a little microaggression, right, that tells you that you don't belong. So again, you think about like if we were wedded to the Bauhaus, and this is what it's the inspiration for our designs. Again, they're designing for a specific body. That is definitely not my body. And more importantly, it's not the body of the majority of people who live in the world. And so maybe we need to dismantle this myth so that we can design for bodies and identities that are not white, cis male, European, injured in body and soul, and working class, because the world is such a bigger place. And again, people are doing the work, right? So these are all the, everyone's like, what references would you have me read? Right? So these are some of the references to read, so you have Carolyn Perez really looking at sort of women bodies, Andy Campbell's Queer X Design, looking at queer bodies, Rama Guerrero and Sean Donohue's Inclusive Design. And again, we have a program at OCAD University in Inclusive Design, so there's so many people. Again, racialized body, looking at the Black experience in design, Indigenous body, looking at the Decolonizing Design group, decolonizing with an S, who are looking at Indigenous bodies all around the world and what it means for design. So the work is being done for us and by us, but it's not just about bodies, because the racist bias is about the culture as well. And this is where the work of Tema Okun and white supremacy culture is really important, because the culture of I must do this all-nighter in order to be prepared for my design crit, that's a little bit of a white supremacy culture. Where's this urgency coming from, right? Where is this sense of again, we've done a good job of dismantling the genius designer, right? But if you still go to AIGA conference, there's a lot of I am such an amazing, singular, brilliant individual, right? That again doesn't talk about the fact design is a team sport. Because you weren't the one who printed that poster. There was a whole fabrication process that took place, and why aren't you including them in your narrative of your individual greatness, right? So there's so much work that needs to be done to not just dismantle design for more diverse bodies, but to change the culture of design from these white supremacist cultural values to ones that embrace 7th generation thinking, that embrace realistic expectations. Oh my gosh, right? That embrace teamwork and transparency and understanding that there are multiple ways of doing things. And again, design is better than other fields. Some of this stuff we already practice, but how can we push it further so that design can be a place that embraces all of the different ways in which we want to be with each other in liberatory joy. So, dismantling the modernist project in design is bringing in those who've been structurally excluded, bringing in their histories and their designs, and the work is being done for us and by us, and that's good. That's a good thing, and we need to continue to do that work. So, conclusion, what does decolonizing design mean? One of the important things that was in the book was to have takeaways. Because I worked too much in consulting to know okay, what am I supposed to do now? This is what you're supposed to do. So if you're wanting to put Indigenous first, you have to figure out your own positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty over the land. And you cannot talk about decolonization without talking about the land. It is about the relationship to the land. And if anyone is talking about something else, they're not talking about decolonization. It's understanding your colonial histories. And again, as I am prime example number one, it's making mistakes, but making also amends. And the beautiful thing about the relationships I have with Indigenous communities is that they love me enough to tell me when I'm doing the wrong thing. And it took a while to recognize that as an act of love, but it's basically saying, we care for you enough that we want to make sure you're not doing things that would spoil the good relations that we want to have with you. And so understanding that critique as an act of love, again, allows you to listen and know how to make amends. And then again, we need to change what we're designing for. If it's like the criteria of evaluation should be, is this bringing liberatory joy to the body and to the communities? And if it's not doing that, maybe it's something that doesn't need to be designed in the universe, because we're designing things that hurt us, that hurt our environment, that hurt our relationships with each other. And as powerful as designers are in the world, we create literally the tangible manifestations of all that is possible. Don't we really want to design a world that is full of, again, liberatory joy? Now, in dismantling the racist bias, white folks, go to therapy, right? And because you need to do the work in really ways just to understand the intergenerational trauma that you have experienced. Because no one gets on a boat to leave their home unless it's life and death. And I know enough white folks, some of my best friends are white folks, right? I know enough of them that they haven't been doing that work to understand what is my grandmother's story, my great-grandmother's story, my mother's story even, that would cause them to leave. And it's hard, because sometimes they don't want to talk about it, right? But if you're not dealing with it, then you are inflicting it on someone else, right? Hurt people hurt other people. And the only way in which we are going to all heal is if white folks start doing the work of healing, because the work of decolonizing design, or decolonization in general, is the work of white folks. We're all here to help you understand where there is hurt in the system. But white folks built the system. Y'all have to be the one who, again, get over that addiction to white supremacy so that you can dismantle those systems so that we can build better ones. Again, the ideal of like, let's everyone have a better life. Let's make it really everyone. Let's drop the things that keep us in conflict with one another, which is not difference. It's that hierarchy of differences. Let's drop the hierarchy. That's the work of white folks, and you can't do that work unless you're dealing with your own intergenerational trauma. And those who have been excluded, we have to claim and reclaim our stories of making until they're shouted from the rafters in every print magazine so that we all know that design is not something that happened in the 1800s in Europe, right? Design is what we've been doing from, at least in the Australian context, 65,000 years. And then we have to cede space. Design firms and institutions and organizations have to cede space to those who are not, let's take the Bauhaus, right? In the bodies of white, European, cis male. Again, some spiritual and physical trauma that they're experiencing. Again, maybe even working class, but we have to cede space. And the beautiful thing, going back to the land acknowledgement, like in the area that I'm in Toronto, when people talk about decolonization, when Indigenous communities talk about decolonization, they talk about the two-row wampum, which is a visualization, is basically like a series of beads which are kind of blue, and there are two lines, two rows. And the covenant is that we all travel our own path without interference in one another, which is basically sharing. Let's say, again, the dish with one spoon wampum is a covenant among Indigenous people that was saying, let's all share in this together. There's enough. There's no scarcity. Let's share in all of this together. So when we say seed power, it's not like kicking anyone out. Let's share, because you're not sharing. You know, you're not sharing. So let's just share the power so that we can all make a world that, again, is about liberatory joy for our bodies and our communities. So thank you very much. Do you have time for questions? I know I heard some of you have to get to class or something.
Some folks may have to get back to class, and you're welcome to run away, but please stay and ask questions. And we're monitoring the online chat back here too, in case anyone has any.
Yes.
I do have to leave because I have to teach class, but I teach typography, and one of the things that I talk to my students about is how very racist typography is because it's based on literacy, right? And so if you withheld literacy from entire groups of people, how could they have contributed to modern type, right? So my question is there a resource that I can point to that maybe you know of or something that you've come across that speaks about like how either different typography could be or that makes a references? Because I have only found like maybe 2 books that even speak about it.
So one of my faculty member, Richard Hunt, wrote a book recently on sort of global typography, or I forget the actual title, but global typography is basically like the thing where he's gone through, because again, one of the advantages in being in Toronto is that we're extraordinarily diverse, and so we again, provide permission for our students who are from all over the place to use their home typographical system. So we have a lot of students from South Korea, from China, from Ethiopia, from, you know, like Lebanon and all those sort of things. So, so he, understanding that and seeking to facilitate that, did a lot of research and work in order to, again, help our students understand that. And actually just last year or year before last, we hired a faculty member who focuses on global typographies. So from Lebanon, which again is amazing in the sense of that, like, that is a place that is multilingual by nature, and there's a lot of great work that is being done, that has been done by Lebanese typographers in terms of kind of like tri-systems of communication and whatever, that sort of is really important, again, for our students. So Richard Hunt, I think if you put in like world typography or something like that, it should sort of show up, but that's one of the resources I would say that we know, but we also use, and we know it has been extraordinarily helpful for our diverse students to understand and feel encouraged, right, to use the typographical systems. Also, and it's quasi out of print, but sometimes you can feel it. There's Saki Mafundikwa has a book called African Alphabets. Yeah, and so again, it's quasi out of print. You can sometimes find, you know, because this is whatever, you can find versions of it. And, you know, like because again, there's a lot of places where we think don't have systems of writing, but they actually do. And again, it's just part of that process of colonization was to suppress, right, to kill off, actually, in many ways, those systems of communication that were there in an Indigenous. And so that's another good resource that we have.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. I'm such a fan. I have to go teach class. Yeah.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Hi. Any other questions? Anyone online? No? Ah, they're just observing. Go ahead.
serve the body. And then thinking about the body as land as it relates to Indigenous people and that direct relationship to serving joy to the body as then being truly a decolonizing thing. I'm not a designer, I'm a printmaker, and then I run the galleries here, and so these are things that in my projects in the school I'm thinking about often, of like, how do we center these voices? How do we give space that is in an ethical framework? But like I said, can I form this into a question? And I think another thing that I did want to ask, and I don't know how to ask it directly, but what you think about differences or overlaps or complications with the words design and craft as it relates to decolonizing.
Okay. I'll answer your first invocation. In the book, I talk about a class that I've taught and I co-created with an Aboriginal colleague, Dr. Norm Sheehan, where basically it was our fundamental, in our master's degree, was the fundamental design studio. And what we took was an Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ideals that the main principles are respect, know, care, and share. What we did and created that is we kind of took Bauhaus principles like point, line, plane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, color, rhythm, all those sort of things, and we put them in dialogue with Indigenous ways of knowing in terms of the principles of respect, know, and care. So respect is about understanding, in many ways, your positionality and your relationship to the land. So the brief was for the students, it was identify a place that has significant emotional and cultural resonance for you. Now do a sketch, and we did various sketches. So we did like 1 minute sketches, 3 minute sketches, 10-minute sketches. They normally had like a long homework of like sketch as long as you like to be able to create the composition. But I was like, okay, do a series of sketches just using point of that place. Now just use lines. Now just use planes. Okay. And they had to tell an oral narrative of that relationship to their place as it was made manifest by the designs that they created, right, from just using point, line, and plane. And so that was, and what was interesting in that, right, where at the end of the semester, the students was like, I'm not sure if I got the Indigenous part of it. But they did, because throughout the semester, the semester they referenced that same place, and we were like, okay, now we're going to add color, now we're going to add rhythm, now we're going to add all these sort of things. And it was always about that deepening that relationship to that place, right? And we combined visual and oral narrative. So again, you had to provide an oral description of, again, your relationship to the place and the design decisions that you made to create the composition. And so at the end of it, it's like if you had it in a composition where you were telling a story about your connection to a place, and you were doing so in ways that evoked all of the meaning that it has, the way in which you demonstrated care through color choices, right? The way in which you demonstrated knowledge by being able to understand the rhythms of the place and somehow visually manifest that is what Indigenous principles is asking us to try to do, right? Just understand your relationship to place and care for that place. Now again, we primed it in terms of choosing a place that they already had a strong, again, cultural or emotional resonance with, but like that feeling is what we need to have for every place that we're at. That's the Indigenous principle, and that's that creating that understanding is what will help in decolonization. Because what for me institutionally, decolonizing design is about is preparing all of us to live under principles of Indigenous sovereignty, to make it comfortable, to make it understandable, so that when Indigenous people take back their lands, right, that first of all, by knowing your positionality, hopefully you're doing things that are like make you a good guest, right? And then, so they're not going to be like, we're going to put you on a boat and send you away. They're like, oh no, you're useful. You come stay, right? The other aspect of it, again, is like making people, the fear, right, of we give indigenous people back their lands is that in many ways, they're going to think that they'll do what the Europeans did, right? Extreme violence in that process, revenge, reverse racism, right? Again, the discourse I hear is like, let's share, right? So preparing ourselves to live under indigenous principles, ways of being, and to have comfort in them, and to know in many ways, like those are meant to be liberatory. That's how you prepare for decolonization. So this is part of preparing our students for decolonization. Seeding the space to indigenous ways of knowing and being, because it's the right thing to do, but also like, they took thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They had some pretty good principles to live through, right? And they were just disrupted by this European, I would say, experiment in extreme violence, right? Because Europeans pre-Egyptian Rome or pre-British, whatever, like they had those principles too, right? And so it's getting back to caring about the land and caring about the people of the land. And that's where Europe took a different track, but they can get back there. And indigenous peoples can help us get back there because they're the ones who have fought so hard against assimilation to begin to still have those ways, to still have that notion of a good life that is not about extraction. And again, it's not to romanticize, because like, again, people make mistakes and they have men. You have to have treaties, right? Because you've been in conflict with one another, right? So it's not a romanticization of it, but of the peoples that are here now, they're the ones who are closest to what, again, this process of creating a context for liberatory joy in our bodies and our communities. And then, what was the second part?
Very maybe different, but the overlap or distinctions or so on between design and craft.
Okay, so I refuse to recognize any hierarchies in the practices of making. And again, it's a tricky thing, because on the one hand, it's like, I know the difference between art and design, but it's always a gray zone. Art, design, craft, that is the great chain of making. The extent to which we dismantle that, it is all good. And I've worked in the past with lots of Indian artisans, and one of them said to me, if I sell my work to a museum, it's art. If I sell my work to, like, the city of Bombay or Mumbai, it's design. If I sell my work to the neighbor, it's craft. Same work. I haven't changed my practice. I'm an artisan. We've been doing this for multiple generations, right? But that distinction is really just who I'm selling it to. So that just shows you like the ridiculousness of that system, right? That puts art on the top. And again, designers, you get them, it's like, okay, like, I don't know why I'm picking fun at AIGA today. Where again, it's like, there's always like the artist comes there and it's like, I was doing all this design and I felt alienated from myself. And so I took a year off and I did art. And then I had a gallery exhibition in a space of white walls. And I felt really connected to myself again, right? And that's buying into that like hierarchy. Because I'm like, if you're making people happy, if you're helping people communicate, like what's the alienation of that, right? And if you're engaging in a set of practices which are so elite and remote in terms of people being able to go see it, then what is that practice, right? And so my thing is dismantle the whole thing. We are all makers, and we make for different audiences, and there is no hierarchy in that making, right? And so you should pay people well for what they do. I'm talking to you, AI, right? You should pay them what they owe them. And we need to get out of that thinking, especially in art and design institutions where we still hold up those hierarchies, right? Because I can say my students don't care. They're like, what do I want to make? I don't care where the practices are coming from. All I care is that I have the skills and the knowledge to make it tangible or intangible, right? In order to be able to connect to the people that I'm wanting to embrace. And most of the time, they're wanting to embrace their own communities through the work. But they can't do that if we're still putting all this energy and maintaining these hierarchies. So I think that's officially it. One more question? Okay. Sure. Okay. Mm. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, again, being on tour, one of the things that I'm most thrilled about in many ways is kind of the reception by the indigenous communities in the places I've gone. But also within my own community, indigenous communities, meaning like at OCAD University, in the way in which my colleagues have responded. Because there's a, and this is the thing, like I love strategy, right? That what they express is what you're expressing now is like these are things that we've been talking about forever and ever and ever. And what they've been doing is using it as a wedge. So they're saying, okay, we're gonna play this game, right? So it's a thing where it's like, we've been saying this forever and you haven't listened to us. So this is a book. It's published by MIT Press. And she is saying things that I'm actually glad I don't have to say, because maybe you'll listen more to her. And my colleagues and I, we've kind of had a little bit of discussion about this, again, in terms of my positionality, because one of them said, it's like, if this was coming from a white person, side eye all the way, right? If it's coming from an indigenous person, they would still try to ignore us. But it's because it's coming from this like oblique angle from a black person who, again, has to like sit down with some humility to be able to say, put indigenous first, right? That all of a sudden, it opens up a possibility to be heard that then we can ride in on, right? And be able to say like, okay, someone who you've tried to divide us from is in solidarity with this. So it's not us standing here alone trying to say these things. There is solidarity that's being built. So we are not just one, so to speak, one group that you can sort of separate and divide. That, again, this is a shift. So when I gave the talk at MIT Press, and MIT in itself, again, the leaders of the Student Association had me sign copies to their chancellor, to their new DEI person, and to the president, because they had a meeting with them that week. And so they were going to gift the book to them, again, as a wedge, and so for me, again, like, you put it out in the world and you don't know how it's going to respond. And so the thing that is making me happy in terms of like my desired intentionality is that it's being useful to opening up conversations, is being useful to hope creating a little bit of space of possibility, and it's being useful to again, Indigenous communities who, with great intentionality, I put first in the narrative. Now, the interesting thing that's happening is, like, in the context of the United States, there's a bit of reckoning that's happening in terms of like the Black response, because in some ways I'm calling out my own community around the 40 acres and the mule, and all of a sudden, again, we thinking of ourselves as the voices of liberation, we're also being called out that we might be the tools of oppression as well. And so there's a little bit of unease, unsettling that's happened in the reception with that. But want to be in dialogue, but most importantly, again, OCAD University has about 15, if not 16, full-time Indigenous faculty members. And so I would just love to put you in dialogue with my colleagues who are living and practicing these conversations every single day. Like, the thing we're trying to figure out now, or they're trying to figure out now, and I'm just trying to support, is how do we dismantle the grading system that doesn't take into account Indigenous pedagogy, right? Like how do you get a A in engaging in your Indigenous identity, right? Like, what does failure of that look like, right? So the discussions right now is like, how do we dismantle our grading systems so that we can practice? We have a program in Indigenous visual culture, so that we can practice our Indigenous pedagogy without this colonial structure telling us that we need to grade people's indigeneity. So I would love to put you in in conversation with my colleagues, because they're doing all of that work. My job is really, my job was just to create the platform and get out of the way, right? And let them take over and support them in what leverage they need to be able to take over the institution of OCAD University, because that's, again, decolonizing design is giving back the land. And so Indigenous folks taking over OCAD University, that's how that begins to happen. So thank you. All right, is that one more? Is that the one?
I think we can call it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.